Imagine looking up one morning and seeing a blinding light streak across the sky. Within seconds, the earth shakes beneath your feet, the air starts to heat up, and the sky glows like fire. That's what it might feel like if a 5-mile wide asteroid slammed into California. And in this case, there wouldn't be much warning. Even if we saw it coming a few days before, there would be almost nothing we could do to stop it. A 5-mile wide asteroid is about the size of Mount Everest, and when something that massive hits Earth at around 40,000 miles per hour, it's not just a local disaster, it's the kind of event that could change the planet. If it struck on land anywhere in California, the first thing to go would be the ground itself. The moment of impact would release energy equal to billions of tons of TNT. That's more powerful than every nuclear bomb ever made combined. The explosion would create a fireball miles wide, instantly vaporizing everything near the point of impact. Cities, highways, forests, gone in an instant. The temperature would rise so fast that people in buildings within hundreds of miles would be incinerated before they even heard the sound of the explosion. The impact would throw huge chunks of earth and rock miles into the sky, sending a massive shockwave rippling out in all directions. Buildings would collapse, power lines would be ripped down, water pipes would burst. Everything in the surrounding area would be leveled. This wave would move so fast and hit so hard it would be like a hurricane, an earthquake, and a volcanic eruption all rolled into one, but worse. If it hit near Los Angeles, the city wouldn't just be destroyed, it would be completely erased. Right after the impact, a massive crater would form, likely over 50 miles wide and several miles deep. The surrounding landscape would be reshaped forever, and the debris, blasted into the sky, would block out the sun across much of the western United States. Fires would break out for hundreds of miles, burning uncontrollably as emergency systems collapse and response crews are completely overwhelmed or wiped out themselves. But the destruction wouldn't stop there. The energy from the impact would trigger massive earthquakes across the western part of the country. The San Andreas Fault would likely rupture in multiple places, and new fault lines might even open. The shaking would be felt across state lines, toppling buildings in places as far away as Arizona and Nevada. Tsunamis would also be triggered, crashing into nearby coastlines. If the asteroid hit even partially in the ocean near California, the waves would be hundreds of feet tall, slamming into the shore within minutes. This is just the beginning of what would follow. The first few minutes alone would be unlike anything humanity has ever seen. And for the people in California and the nearby regions, survival would depend entirely on distance and luck. Now, the wave of destruction begins to spread across the map. Let's look at what happens next. Within the first hour after impact, the destruction would keep spreading far beyond California. Massive shock waves would roll across the western United States, toppling buildings as far as Salt Lake City, shaking the ground in Denver, and breaking windows in cities over 1,000 miles away. Roads and highways would be torn apart, bridges would collapse, and power grids would fail. Millions of people would be cut off from help, with cell towers down and communication systems overloaded or completely destroyed. The western skies would be filled with thick black smoke, ash and dust rising from thousands of fires. Some started by the heat of the blast, others by broken gas lines and collapsing electrical systems. Inland cities like Fresno, Bakersfield, and Sacramento would be reduced to rubble from the force of the shockwave alone. Buildings that weren't destroyed instantly would soon be brought down by aftershocks and spreading fires. Hospitals, police stations, and emergency services would either be gone or overwhelmed. Survivors would be scrambling to find clean air, shelter, and water. With debris covering the roads and the entire region in chaos, evacuation would be nearly impossible. Planes wouldn't be able to fly through the ash-filled skies, and helicopters could only reach a limited few before running out of fuel or being grounded by dangerous winds. As the blast zone widens, coastal cities like San Diego, San Francisco, and even parts of Seattle would be hit by massive tsunamis if the asteroid struck near the Pacific Ocean. These waves could reach heights of several hundred feet, flooding entire cities and washing away ports, airports, and residential areas. The salt water would flood deep inland, leaving behind toxic sludge and wreckage. Ships out at sea would either be capsized or lifted and hurled onto land by the force of the water. Entire neighborhoods would be swept away like driftwood. Meanwhile, the skies would darken across the entire continent. The asteroid would throw up millions of tons of dust and ash into the atmosphere, carried by the upper-level winds across the country. Places as far as Texas and even the East Coast would soon see ash falling from the sky like dirty snow. The sun would grow dim and temperatures would begin to drop, especially at night. People would be forced indoors, not just because of the danger, but because the air would be filled with ash particles that could clog lungs and poison water sources. By the end of the first day, tens of millions of people across the western half of the country would either be injured, displaced, or missing. Emergency broadcasts would play on repeat if they were still functioning, warning people to stay inside, wear masks, and avoid contaminated water. The US government and military would begin mobilizing, but the scale of the disaster would be beyond anything ever prepared for. Entire states would essentially be cut off, operating without fuel, electricity, or any connection to the outside world. And the worst part, this was still only the beginning. In the next part, we'll look at what happens over the next week and month, how far the damage spreads, which cities survive, and what the world starts to look like as the ash settles. Over the next few days, the damage would grow even worse as the full effects of the asteroid hit start to unfold. California, once home to nearly 40 million people, would now be unrecognizable. Entire city maps would be useless. Craters, collapsed highways, and flooded coastlines would erase any familiar landmarks. Survivors in Central and Southern California would have no electricity, no clean water, and very little access to food. The government would try to deliver emergency aid, but most airports would be destroyed, and the skies would be too dangerous for regular air traffic. Military cargo planes and helicopters would be forced to land in makeshift zones far outside the impact area. Beyond California, neighboring states like Nevada, Arizona, and Oregon would begin to feel secondary effects. Hospitals in cities like Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Portland would be overwhelmed as evacuees flood in, many suffering from burns, broken bones, and lung damage from breathing ash. Grocery store shelves would empty in hours, gas stations would run dry, and traffic out of the west would clog every major road. Entire communities would set up camps in parking lots, schools, or open fields just to have somewhere to sleep. Cities once thought to be safe would struggle under the weight of refugees and the collapse of basic systems. Meanwhile, the skies would continue to grow darker. The dust and ash pushed into the upper atmosphere by the asteroid would start to block sunlight across much of the western hemisphere. By the end of the first week, daytime would look like evening in many places. Crops would begin to die from lack of sunlight, and temperatures would drop noticeably. In California's Central Valley, where much of America's produce is grown, farms would be buried under layers of soot. The food supply chain, already fragile, would begin to break down. The effects would stretch across the country, with prices rising and panic growing. Wildlife across North America would be thrown into chaos. Forests near the Rockies and along the west coast would burn uncontrollably, releasing more smoke into the atmosphere. Rivers and lakes would become clogged with debris and polluted from chemical runoff and dead animals. Birds would fall from the sky, confused by the lack of light, while fish die-offs would begin in both saltwater and freshwater systems. The sound of sirens, distant explosions, and silence where bustling cities once stood would be all that remained in many parts of the western United States. By the end of the first month, millions of people would still be unaccounted for, and entire regions would be labeled as unreachable. National and international aid would begin pouring in, but even the rest of the world would start to feel the ripple effects. Trade routes through California's major ports would be destroyed, stock markets would spiral, and the rest of the planet would watch and wait, wondering how bad the long-term consequences could really get. In the final part, we'll take a look at what life could look like 1 year after the impact, how the world adapts, what's left of the West Coast, and the lasting scars this event would leave on the planet. 1 year after the 5-mile-wide asteroid hit California, the world would be in a completely different place. The physical damage in California would still be beyond repair. Cities like Los Angeles, San Diego, and Sacramento would no longer exist in any recognizable form. What was once dense urban sprawl would now be a mixture of dry craters, twisted metal, collapsed concrete, and growing vegetation trying to reclaim the ruins. The crater itself, several miles wide and hundreds of feet deep, would be filled with stagnant water surrounded by the skeletal remains of highways and buildings. It would become a dead zone, not just from the impact, but from radiation and lingering atmospheric poisons kicked up during the explosion. For those who had survived, life would be about survival, not rebuilding. Makeshift towns would rise in the outskirts of the country, formed from shipping containers, scrap metal, and salvaged supplies. Most survivors would live without electricity, plumbing, or regular medical care. Diseases would spread faster in overcrowded shelters, and clean water would still be a daily struggle. Many would have moved to the east, trying to escape the choking air and find stability, but the entire country would be facing its own set of problems by then. The rest of the Russia United States would now be dealing with a completely shifted economy. With California's agricultural centers gone, there would be a long-term food shortage. Farms in the Midwest and Southeast would try to keep up, but the loss of the Central Valley alone would have driven produce prices through the roof. Gas and oil would become even harder to transport, with so much of the West Coast shipping infrastructure destroyed. Unemployment would skyrocket, whole industries tied to the tech world, entertainment and trade would disappear overnight. The economic weight of rebuilding just a fraction of what was lost would be unlike anything the country had ever faced. The atmosphere itself would still be unstable. With so much ash and debris pushed into the sky, weather patterns would shift dramatically, global temperatures would drop. What scientists call an impact winter would settle in. Crops around the world would suffer, not just in the US, but across Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa. The sky would remain tinted in shades of gray, with red sunsets and dim mornings becoming the new normal. Climates would change rapidly, causing storms in places that rarely experienced them and drying out areas that used to be lush. But even with all this destruction, the world would try to move forward. People would form new governments in damaged regions. Aid from around the globe would help keep some areas stable. Scientists would spend years studying the crater, the asteroid fragments, and the effects on Earth's climate. And slowly the global conversation would shift from shock to survival, then to prevention. It would become clear that space isn't just vast and empty, it's filled with potential threats. And after witnessing what a single rock 5 miles wide could do, no one would ever look at the sky the same way again. Imagine a massive wave, 1,000 feet tall, rushing toward the west coast of the United States. To put that in perspective, that's taller than the tallest buildings in many cities. This kind of wave is called a Megatsunami, and it's far beyond the size of any normal tsunami we've ever seen. While normal tsunamis caused by earthquakes or underwater landslides are often under 100 feet tall when they hit land, a 1,000-foot wave is on a whole different level. So what would happen if something this huge struck the Pacific coast? First, it's important to know that a wave this size would likely be caused by a massive underwater landslide or a super violent volcanic eruption near the coast. It wouldn't be like the usual earthquakes that caused tsunamis, but more like a sudden collapse of a giant chunk of the ocean floor, pushing an enormous amount of water upward and toward the shore. The energy released would be unimaginably powerful. As the wave approaches the coast, it would move incredibly fast, traveling many miles per hour, much faster than a person can run. Unlike regular ocean waves that you can see rolling gently toward the beach, a mega tsunami is more like a wall of water. It would rise up suddenly, flooding the coastline with massive force. Cities along the coast like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, and Portland would be in the direct path facing total destruction. The wave would destroy everything in its way: buildings, roads, bridges, and homes, sweeping away cars, boats, and even large ships. Because it's so tall, the water would reach far inland, flooding many miles from the coast. The shape of the land would affect how far it spreads, but low-lying areas could be completely underwater. The damage to infrastructure would be catastrophic, cutting off power, water, and communications for weeks or months. Emergency services would be overwhelmed immediately. The initial impact would cause a huge loss of life, especially in crowded urban areas without enough warning time. Even with modern technology and early warning systems, a wave this large would give very little time for people to evacuate safely. Coastal towns and cities would face a disaster on a scale never seen before in American history. As the wave moves inland, it would carry a massive amount of debris, including trees, vehicles, and parts of buildings, turning everything into deadly projectiles. The destruction wouldn't be just from the water, but also from the force of all this debris crashing into structures and people. After the first rush, there would likely be smaller waves following, continuing to cause damage and flooding. Overall, a 1,000-foot wave hitting the west coast would be a nightmare scenario. The sheer force, speed, and height of the water would overwhelm everything in its path. But this is just the beginning. What happens after the wave hits? The long-term effects on the environment, people, and cities would be just as devastating. After the initial wave crashes onto the shore, the damage would only start to reveal itself more clearly. The immediate flooding would begin to recede, but what's left behind would be a landscape completely transformed. Roads and highways along the coast would be washed away or buried under mud and debris. Bridges might be twisted or broken, making travel and rescue efforts nearly impossible in many places. Ports and harbors which are vital for trade and supplies, would likely be destroyed or severely damaged, cutting off crucial access for ships. The water from such a massive wave would carry a huge amount of sediment, salt, and debris far inland. This would poison freshwater sources like rivers, lakes, and underground aquifers. Farms and fields would be covered in salt water and mud, making the soil unusable for growing crops for a long time. The loss of food production would add to the already overwhelming challenges faced by survivors. In the weeks following the wave, thousands of people would be displaced, forced to live in emergency shelters or makeshift camps. Cities would struggle to provide basic needs such as clean water, food, and medical care. Hospitals and clinics close to the coast might be damaged or overwhelmed with injured people, creating a healthcare crisis. Power grids already knocked out by the flood would take months to repair, leaving millions without electricity through harsh weather conditions. Environmental damage would also be severe. Coastal ecosystems, including wetlands, beaches, and forests, would be destroyed or severely altered. Many animal species would lose their habitats or die in the disaster. The salty floodwaters could kill freshwater fish and other aquatic life. Toxic chemicals and oil from damaged factories, storage tanks, and vehicles could leak into the environment, causing pollution and long-term health hazards for people and wildlife. Beyond the physical destruction, the psychological impact would be enormous. Communities shattered by loss of family, friends, homes, and jobs would face years of recovery. Mental health issues like trauma, anxiety, and depression would rise sharply. Governments and organizations would need to provide not only physical rebuilding but emotional support to help people cope with what they experienced. The economic damage would be staggering. Coastal cities contribute billions of dollars to the national economy every year through business, tourism, and industry. The destruction of infrastructure and property, combined with the loss of productivity, could lead to a recession or even a depression in the affected regions. Insurance companies would face huge claims, and rebuilding costs could run into hundreds of billions of dollars, if not more. So while the wave itself might last only minutes as it crashes ashore, the aftermath would last years or even decades. The ripple effects would be felt not just on the West Coast, but across the entire country as communities try to recover and rebuild from this unprecedented disaster. One of the biggest challenges after a 1,000-foot tsunami hits the West Coast would be dealing with the long-term environmental and climate effects. When such a massive amount of seawater floods inland, it doesn't just vanish quickly. Saltwater can linger in the soil and groundwater for months or even years, making it very hard to restore farms and natural vegetation. This would cause food shortages and threaten the livelihoods of many people who depend on farming and fishing. The ocean itself would also change in the days and weeks after the wave. The force of the tsunami would stir up the ocean floor, lifting sediment and possibly toxic substances like heavy metals and chemicals trapped in the seabed. This pollution could harm marine life far from the coast, disrupting entire ecosystems. Coral reefs, fish populations, and marine mammals would face serious threats, affecting both biodiversity and fishing industries that communities rely on for food and income. In addition to environmental damage, the social and economic effects would keep spreading. Many small towns and communities along the coast would lose homes and businesses. Some might never fully recover or could even disappear if people move away to safer areas. This kind of disaster could cause a large shift in population, with many people relocating inland or to other states, changing the social fabric of the region. The government and emergency agencies would also face huge pressure. Rescue and relief operations would have to cover a massive area with millions of people affected. Roads and airports could be damaged, making it harder to get supplies and help to those in need. Coordinating efforts between federal, state, and local levels would be critical but very complicated. Planning for future disasters would likely change a lot after this event, with more focus on early warning systems and evacuation plans. On a broader scale, the global economy might feel some effects too. The west coast of the United States is home to major ports like Los Angeles, Seattle, and Portland. These ports handle a large part of the country's imports and exports. If they are damaged or closed for a long time, supply chains could be disrupted, causing shortages and price increases on goods across the United States and even worldwide. One final, often overlooked consequence would be the cultural and historical losses. Coastal cities have many important landmarks, museums, and heritage sites. Many of these could be damaged or lost forever. Preserving memories and history in the face of such a disaster would be a tough challenge for communities trying to rebuild their identity and spirit. The long road to recovery would not just be about fixing buildings and roads, but also about restoring hope and normal life for millions of people affected by a tsunami of this size. Looking further ahead, the rebuilding process after a 1,000-foot tsunami would take years, maybe even decades. Communities would need to rethink how they build near the coast to avoid the same kind of destruction in the future. That could mean stricter building codes, creating buffer zones with natural barriers like wetlands, and investing in better early warning systems to give people more time to evacuate. Urban planners and engineers would have to work together to design cities that can withstand or avoid the worst damage from future tsunamis. Insurance companies would also face huge challenges. With damage on this scale, many might struggle to pay out claims, and some people could find it difficult to get insurance for coastal properties afterward. This would affect the housing market and could change where people decide to live long term. Mental health would be another major concern. Surviving such a catastrophic event would leave many people with trauma, grief, and anxiety. Support systems, including counseling, community programs, and mental health services, would be crucial in helping survivors rebuild their lives emotionally as well as physically. In the bigger picture, this kind of disaster would likely change how the world thinks about natural risks. Governments and scientists might push for more international cooperation on monitoring earthquakes, volcanic activity, and ocean conditions that can lead to giant tsunamis. Investing in global early warning networks could save countless lives in the future. Schools and communities would also likely include more education about natural disasters and survival skills. Knowing what to do when a tsunami warning sounds could make a huge difference in saving lives. Drills, clear evacuation routes, and public awareness campaigns would become standard in coastal areas. Despite all the destruction and hardship, history shows that people often come together after disasters like this. Neighbors help neighbors, volunteers arrive from other states, and communities work hard to recover and rebuild stronger than before. Technology and science would also play a big role in improving disaster response and recovery efforts. In the end, while the damage from a 1,000-foot tsunami hitting the west coast would be unimaginable, the response and resilience of people could inspire hope. Preparing for such a rare but powerful event is essential to protect lives and reduce the impact when nature shows its greatest force. When people hear the word megathrust, it might not sound like much, but in the world of natural disasters, it's one of the most dangerous things that can happen. A megathrust earthquake is not your typical ground-shaking event. These are the massive quakes that happen where two tectonic plates collide, with one being pushed under the other. These collisions happen in subduction zones, and when they release all that built-up pressure, the result can be truly devastating. To get an idea of what this could look like, we only need to go back to the year 2011, when Japan experienced one of the most powerful megathrust earthquakes ever recorded. That quake struck off the coast of Tohoku and caused not just intense ground shaking, but also a giant tsunami that swept inland, destroying entire towns and causing over $360 billion in damages. That single event remains one of the costliest natural disasters in history, and it shows just how dangerous these types of earthquakes really are. Now imagine if something like that were to happen again, but this time in a different part of the world that isn't as well prepared. Scientists have been warning about the Cascadia subduction zone along the Pacific Northwest coast of the United States. This fault runs from Northern California all the way up to British Columbia, and it has been quiet for a long time, maybe too long. Experts believe that if the Cascadia fault were to rupture in a full megathrust event, it could result in a quake larger than magnitude 9. That's strong enough to shake the ground for minutes, not just seconds, which is more than enough time to cause serious destruction. The first wave of damage would come from the shaking itself. Buildings not designed to handle that kind of movement would crumble. Bridges could collapse. Roads would crack wide open, and power lines would snap. People in cities like Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver could be hit hard, and even areas far inland would feel the effects. Hospitals and emergency services would likely be overwhelmed right away, especially if communication systems go down too. But the shaking is just the beginning. One of the most dangerous parts of a megathrust earthquake is the tsunami that usually follows. Because the ocean floor gets violently shoved upward during the quake, it sends a massive surge of water racing across the sea. In some places, there would only be a few minutes of warning. Entire coastal communities could be swallowed by waves taller than houses. In low-lying towns near the coast, there would be little time to get to higher ground. What makes megathrust earthquakes so scary is that they don't just affect one city or one area. They can impact whole regions at once. Ports, airports, highways, and train systems could all be knocked out in a matter of minutes, and once that happens, getting supplies, rescue crews, or even basic help into the disaster zone becomes incredibly difficult. Even the ground itself could change forever. These earthquakes can cause the land to drop several feet, which means that some places that used to be above sea level could suddenly find themselves permanently underwater. That's not just a short-term problem, that's long-term flooding that could wipe towns right off the map. This is why scientists are so focused on megathrust earthquakes. They don't happen often, but when they do, the damage is off the charts. The next one could hit without warning, and if it does, the question is not just where or when, it's how bad will it be. One of the biggest challenges with megathrust earthquakes is how little warning people get before they strike. Unlike hurricanes or storms that can be tracked days in advance, these earthquakes happen deep beneath the surface, where pressure quietly builds over decades or even centuries. Then suddenly, everything gives way. That moment when all the energy is released at once is what makes these events so powerful and dangerous. Researchers are using tools like GPS satellites and deep sea sensors to try and understand where this stress is building and how close we might be to a major event. These tools can detect tiny movements in the Earth's crust, sometimes just a few millimeters a year, but over time those tiny shifts mean something big is coming. Some areas, like the Pacific Northwest, have been slowly moving for hundreds of years without a large quake to release that pressure, and when it finally does happen, it won't be a small release. It'll be the kind of sudden, violent shift that sends shock waves for hundreds of miles in every direction. The damage wouldn't just stop at buildings and roads. A megathrust earthquake would also severely impact basic infrastructure, especially utilities. Power grids would be knocked out, gas lines could rupture and catch fire, and water systems could break down entirely. That could leave millions of people without electricity, clean water, or heat, especially if it happens during colder months. In coastal areas, seawalls and flood defenses might be destroyed by the tsunami, leaving communities vulnerable to more damage after the initial impact. And then there's the economic side. Ports that serve as hubs for imports and exports could be destroyed in minutes. In the United States alone, ports like Seattle and Portland handle billions of dollars worth of goods each year. If those are shut down, supply chains would be disrupted, not just locally, but globally. Everything from food and fuel to electronics and medicine could suddenly become hard to get. Large businesses might have backup plans, but small businesses and everyday people would struggle to bounce back. Insurance claims would flood in, and rebuilding would take years. Even 10 years after the quake in Japan in the year 2011, some coastal towns were still struggling to recover. Now imagine that kind of damage happening in several countries at once. That's the scale we're talking about when it comes to a megathrust earthquake. One of the most serious problems would be housing. With thousands or even hundreds of thousands of buildings damaged or destroyed, many people would be forced to leave their homes. Emergency shelters would fill quickly, and some people might not be able to return home for months or even years. In areas hit hardest by tsunamis, entire neighborhoods might be gone altogether. That kind of displacement can have long-lasting effects on families, schools, and entire communities. What makes all of this even more difficult is that megathrust earthquakes often strike areas that are heavily populated and near the ocean. That means there's a higher risk for loss of life, damage to property, and disruption to everyday life. These aren't isolated mountain regions with few people. They're often major cities, ports, and transportation centers that millions of people rely on every single day. And while scientists are getting better at understanding where these events are most likely to happen, predicting exactly when they will hit is still impossible. That's why so many researchers are focused on preparation rather than prediction, because when the next one hits, and it will be too late to prepare. One of the most dangerous things about a megathrust earthquake is what follows it. Massive aftershocks that can last for weeks or even months. Aftershocks might not be as strong as the initial quake, but they still cause serious damage, especially to already weakened buildings and roads, hospitals, emergency shelters, and communication systems that barely held together after the first quake could collapse entirely during one of these follow-up quakes. In addition to the shaking, the ground itself can shift in ways that completely change the landscape. In past megathrust earthquakes, entire coastlines have moved. In the year 2011, parts of Japan's shoreline shifted by more than 8 feet. That kind of sudden land movement can change the course of rivers, damage pipelines, and even affect underground aquifers. Bridges, railways, and highways could be left twisted or broken, cutting off entire regions from help. One of the most overlooked threats that follows a megathrust earthquake is disease. When clean water is hard to come by, sanitation systems are broken, and thousands of people are packed into emergency shelters, it creates the perfect conditions for illness to spread. In the aftermath of past earthquakes, outbreaks of stomach viruses, respiratory infections, and skin diseases have been common. If it happens in colder climates, things like hypothermia and frostbite also become major concerns, especially if heating systems are down for long periods. Farming regions near subduction zones would also be hit hard. Farmland could be flooded by tsunamis, contaminated with salt water, or completely shifted by the force of the quake. Crops could be wiped out for the season, and irrigation systems might be destroyed. That means fewer food supplies, higher prices, and even shortages, especially if supply lines are already down due to damage at ports and roads. There's also the mental toll. Survivors of megathrust earthquakes often deal with trauma, stress, and anxiety for years afterward. The constant fear of aftershocks, the uncertainty about whether homes and schools will ever be rebuilt, and the loss of loved ones all take a toll on people's health and well-being. Children in particular are deeply affected by the sudden change in routine and the chaos around them. Another long-term concern is how such a disaster would affect global cooperation. If multiple countries are hit at once, or if one country is hit so hard that it needs outside help, there could be competition for resources. Things like rescue crews, medical supplies, construction materials, and even food aid might not be available in large enough quantities to help everyone right away. This can lead to tension, especially if the disaster disrupts diplomatic or trade relationships. Scientists have even warned that megathrust earthquakes could trigger additional earthquakes in nearby regions. When one fault shifts, it can sometimes cause pressure to build up in surrounding faults. That means a single massive earthquake could start a chain reaction of seismic activity in places that weren't even directly hit at first. That kind of domino effect could cause problems across entire continents. Finally, there's the environmental cost. Landslides caused by the earthquake could bury forests, rivers could become blocked or redirected, and chemical spills from damaged factories or power plants could leak into the soil and air. In areas where nuclear power plants sit near fault lines or coastlines, there's also the fear of radiation leaks. These environmental disasters can take decades to clean up and may leave some areas unsafe to live in for generations. When we think about the next megathrust earthquake, one of the most important things to talk about is how communities can prepare before it happens. In places near subduction zones like the Pacific Northwest, emergency planners are focusing more and more on building codes. Stronger rules mean new buildings must be designed to sway with the ground rather than crack and fall. These changes might seem small, but they can save thousands of lives when a major earthquake hits. One major concern for coastal towns is evacuation. Because megathrust earthquakes often cause tsunamis, people near the ocean only have a short window, sometimes just 10 to 15 minutes, to get to high ground. That's why communities in places like Oregon, Washington, and parts of British Columbia have started building vertical evacuation towers. These structures are specially designed to withstand the shaking and the waves, giving people a place to run if there's no time to drive inland. In many areas, especially along the Ring of Fire, scientists are pushing for better early warning systems. These systems can detect the first signs of a quake and send out alerts before the worst shaking starts. In Japan, for example, their system can give people up to a minute of warning. That may not sound like much, but it's enough time to stop trains, shut down gas lines, and tell people to get to safety. The hope is that more countries will invest in these systems before the next disaster strikes. Schools and hospitals are also being reevaluated. Many older buildings weren't built with megathrust quakes in mind. In places like Chile and Indonesia, major hospital upgrades have started, so that emergency services don't collapse right when they're needed most. In the United States, California has already spent billions reinforcing hospitals to make sure they stay standing during a major quake. These upgrades are costly, but when disaster hits, they can be the difference between life and death for thousands. One challenge that's harder to fix is economic resilience. If a megathrust earthquake destroys a major port, it can stall the economy of an entire country. Take the Port of Los Angeles or the Port of Vancouver. Both handle huge amounts of cargo. If they go offline, it doesn't just affect the West Coast. It can delay supplies across the country. This is why disaster planning now includes alternative routes and backup transportation hubs to keep goods moving even if major ports are damaged. Another area being explored is how nature can help us. In some countries, engineers are working with natural defenses like coastal forests and wetlands to reduce the impact of tsunamis. These natural barriers can slow waves down and help protect inland areas. While they can't stop the damage completely, they can reduce it enough to save lives and property. People are also being taught what to do when the ground starts shaking. Emergency drills are now part of school routines in many earthquake-prone areas. Families are encouraged to have go bags ready, filled with water, food, first aid supplies, and important documents. Cities are running simulations that test how well their response plans actually work. The idea is to make sure that when the time comes, everyone knows what to do without having to stop and think. One of the biggest lessons from past megathrust earthquakes is that rebuilding takes time, years or even decades. Some areas in Japan are still recovering from the quake and tsunami that hit in the year 2011. It takes a long time to bring back roads, homes, businesses, and a sense of normal life. That's why planning for recovery is just as important as planning for the earthquake itself. Who will pay for the rebuilding? How can communities make sure they rebuild smarter and safer than before? And in the end, the next megathrust earthquake will not just test buildings and roads, it will test how well people can work together. From local leaders to national governments, from neighbors helping neighbors to scientists and engineers building better systems, every piece matters. There's no way to stop the next megathrust earthquake, but by preparing now, we can make sure we're ready to survive it and to recover afterward stronger than before. If a supervolcano ever erupted off the coast of Oregon, the first signs wouldn't be an explosion right away. It would probably start with strange activity deep below the ocean floor. Scientists would notice small earthquakes happening more often than usual, along with a rising dome of lava slowly pushing up the seafloor. That part of the Pacific Ocean, near the Juan de Fuca Ridge, is already geologically active. It sits right on the edge of the Cascadia subduction zone, where two tectonic plates are constantly grinding against each other. So the warning signs might look like normal volcanic or earthquake activity at first. But this would be different, more intense, and happening all at once. The water temperature around the area might start rising, steam vents and plumes of gas would rise up from the ocean floor and the water could turn cloudy or discolored. Fish and marine animals might start fleeing the area, reacting to sudden changes in pressure, temperature, and chemicals. Scientists monitoring the area would detect rising levels of sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide. That's when alarm bells would really go off. These are the types of gases released when magma is building up close to the surface, and a massive amount of it could mean a supervolcano is getting ready to blow. News reports would start coming in, warning people along the Oregon and Northern California coasts. Emergency services would begin preparing for a possible eruption. The U.S. Geological Survey and NOAA would issue alerts and begin tracking everything closely. People living along the coast might be told to evacuate even though the volcano is still underwater. That's because a supervolcano under the sea doesn't just erupt with lava, it can trigger tsunamis, massive clouds of ash, and poisonous gases. Then it would happen. If the volcano erupted all at once, the explosion would be unlike anything anyone has ever seen. The force would send a huge plume of ash, gas, and debris shooting up from the ocean. Since water would instantly flash into steam when it hit the magma, the explosion could be even more violent than one on land. The blast would destroy everything within dozens of miles, both under the sea and in the air. A massive crater would be left on the ocean floor. The eruption would also displace a massive amount of seawater, likely triggering a powerful tsunami almost immediately. That wave would start racing across the ocean in every direction. Coastal towns along Oregon, Washington, and Northern California would only have minutes to react. Even places as far away as Alaska and Hawaii could feel the effects. The ash cloud, meanwhile, would begin spreading high into the atmosphere, carried by strong winds. Planes would be grounded, skies would go dark, and breathing outside could become dangerous. That would just be the beginning. In the next part, we'll look at what happens in the hours and days after the eruption and how it could affect not just the West Coast, but the entire country. In the hours right after the eruption, the West Coast would be in chaos. The tsunami triggered by the explosion would hit the Oregon coastline first. Towns like Newport, Lincoln City, and Coos Bay would be among the first to get hit. With only minutes of warning, many people wouldn't have time to get to higher ground. Waves as tall as buildings would crash into the shore, wiping out homes, roads, and anything in their path. The force of the water would drag debris miles inland, turning once peaceful neighborhoods into wreckage. Farther down the coast, places in Northern California, like Crescent City and Eureka, would also feel the full power of the wave. Washington's coast wouldn't be spared either. The water would slam into the ports, flood highways, and knock out power. Emergency systems would be overwhelmed. First responders would be racing to help, but the damage would make many areas impossible to reach. Entire stretches of coastline might become completely unrecognizable in just a few hours. At the same time, the ash cloud from the eruption would begin drifting across the sky. Depending on wind direction, it could move inland fast. Ash is not like soft snow. It's more like tiny pieces of glass. When it settles, it clogs engines, shuts down power plants, and makes it hard to breathe. Towns as far inland as Eugene, Bend, and even Boise could find themselves covered in a gray, suffocating layer. Breathing outside without a mask would become dangerous, especially for kids, the elderly, or anyone with asthma or other lung issues. Flights across the Pacific Northwest would be canceled. Airports from Portland to San Francisco would shut down, and skies across the region would be eerily quiet. Ash in the upper atmosphere can stall jet engines, and no one would take the risk of flying through it. Major highways would be buried in ash and debris, making ground travel nearly impossible in some areas. The power grid would be in serious trouble too. Ashfall can cause transformers to short out and power lines to snap. Some cities could lose power for days or even weeks. With communication lines down, it would become harder for emergency crews to coordinate. People in the worst hit areas might be cut off completely, unable to call for help or even find out what's happening beyond their own street. Food and clean water would start becoming scarce fast. Grocery stores wouldn't be able to restock, and ash would contaminate rivers and reservoirs. Cities would urge people to boil water before drinking it if they still had power. Hospitals would quickly fill up with people suffering from injuries, breathing problems, or exposure to the elements. In some places, makeshift shelters would have to be set up to house survivors. And all of this would be happening just in the first day or two. If the supervolcano off the coast of Oregon were to erupt with full force, one of the most dangerous things to come right after the blast would be the wave. Not just a regular wave, but a giant, unstoppable wall of water. We're talking about a tsunami that could be hundreds of feet high, moving at the speed of a jetliner. When that much of the ocean floor gets torn open and shoved around in such a short amount of time, the ocean has nowhere else to go. It rises, and it crashes toward the land with unbelievable power. This wave wouldn't just hit Oregon, it would slam into the entire west coast. Places like Crescent City, Eureka, and Coos Bay would be among the first to feel it. Cities like San Francisco and Seattle wouldn't be far behind. Depending on where the eruption started and how the seafloor moved, some places might only get minutes of warning. Others could have up to an hour, but when the wave came, it would come fast, and it would come hard. Entire coastal towns could be wiped out in one single strike. Buildings, roads, cars, and even people would be swept away. The tsunami wouldn't be one clean wave and then it's over either. There could be multiple waves coming in and out for hours. The first one might weaken buildings. The second or third could finish them off. Even places several miles inland would not be safe, especially in lower lying areas where the water could push its way through rivers and bays. Ports and harbors would be destroyed. Fishing boats, container ships, and ferries would be tossed around like toys. Any oil tankers nearby could be damaged, causing leaks into the ocean. That would create a whole new environmental disaster on top of the eruption. Emergency services would be stretched too thin. Even if rescue teams were prepared for a normal tsunami, this wouldn't be normal. A supervolcano-triggered wave is on another level. Coastal highways would vanish. Power lines would go down. Communication would be lost in many areas. People would be separated from their families. Cell towers near the coast would be gone in an instant, and that would make it even harder for people to know what was coming next. Meanwhile, people farther inland would be watching the news, trying to understand what was going on. Shelters would fill up quickly, evacuations would have to move even faster. Airports in cities like Portland and Sacramento would be packed with people trying to get out, but many flights would still be grounded because of the ash in the air. That means the roads would be jammed, gas stations would run dry, and tempers would rise. People would be scared, confused, and desperate, and this isn't just about the United States. A wave that big, starting in the Pacific, wouldn't stop at one country's border. After it hit the west coast, it would keep going. Hours later, it could reach Hawaii. Eventually, it might even make it as far as Japan, the Philippines, and parts of Australia. It would lose some power the farther it traveled, but it would still be strong enough to do damage. In the middle of all this, the volcano could still be active. That's what makes the situation so scary. The eruption, the ash, the fires, the wave, none of it means it's over. In the final part, we'll talk about what the world could look like after all this. Could life return to normal, or would things be changed forever? In the weeks and months after this supervolcano erupted off the coast of Oregon, the world would be a very different place. The skies across large parts of the globe would still be filled with ash. That thick gray dust would block out sunlight, drop temperatures, and make it hard to breathe in some areas. Crops would fail, especially in the northern hemisphere. Farmers in places like California, Canada, and even parts of Europe might see their entire harvest ruined by cold, dark skies and falling ash. This sudden change in the climate is sometimes called a volcanic winter. It has happened before, thousands of years ago, when other supervolcanoes erupted. Back then, global temperatures dropped by several degrees for months or even years. If this were to happen today, food would quickly become a global crisis. Grocery store shelves would empty fast. Countries that rely on imported food would be hit the hardest. That includes places like Japan, the United Kingdom, and many island nations. With food supplies down and power grids damaged from the eruption, millions of people could find themselves in the dark and hungry. Some might be forced to move, creating huge waves of climate refugees. Major cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle might lose power for weeks. Clean drinking water would also become harder to find, especially if local water sources were contaminated with ash or debris. The economic fallout would be massive. Entire industries could collapse, especially those that rely on travel, farming, or shipping. Global stock markets would crash. Factories might shut down because they could not get the parts or materials they need. Businesses in every corner of the world would feel the impact, even if they were nowhere near the blast zone. The damage to the ocean would also have long-term effects. The massive tsunami would have pushed salt water deep into freshwater rivers and destroyed coral reefs and underwater ecosystems. Fish populations would take years to bounce back, and if oil tankers or chemical plants near the coast had leaked during the disaster, marine life might never fully recover. At the same time, governments around the world would be trying to figure out how to respond. Emergency funds would run out quickly. The United Nations might step in, sending aid to the hardest hit areas. Countries might have to work together more closely than ever before, just to make sure people could eat, stay warm, and survive the next winter. There would also be deep emotional scars. Millions of people would lose homes, loved ones, and any sense of normal life. Schools would close for months, maybe longer. Hospitals in some areas might shut down from lack of supplies or electricity. Mental health problems like anxiety, fear, and grief would rise in every community touched by the disaster. And even after the ash cleared and the skies brightened, the threat of more eruptions could still hang over everyone's heads. Scientists would continue to monitor the area closely, unsure if the worst was truly over. It might take decades for coastal towns to rebuild, if they are ever rebuilt at all. But even in all of that darkness, there would be signs of hope. People tend to come together in times of crisis. Volunteers would help rescue efforts, families would rebuild homes, communities would share food and supplies, and slowly, day by day, life could start to come back. Still, if a supervolcano ever erupts off the coast of Oregon, the world as we know it would never be the same again. The damage wouldn't just be about what was lost, but about how we learned to live in a world that suddenly became very different.